What would drive a loving grandmother to walk away from the little boy who needed her most? On a quiet afternoon, with tears in her eyes and faith in her heart, she made the hardest decision of her life, leaving him behind and praying for a miracle. Alone and afraid, the child waited. But he was never truly alone. A lost dog, a grieving man, and a divine plan were already in motion. Was it fate or was it God's hand at work? Dear family, which country are you watching from? Leave a comment below and don't forget to subscribe to support us. Now let's get started. Riverton had never been kind to those who had nothing, and now Eleanor Carter had nothing left but a child and a fear she couldn't outrun. The city groaned under the weight of its own neglect. Sidewalks cracked like dry earth after a long drought. Buildings leaned against each other as if exhaustion had crept into their foundations. Faded neon signs flickered above boarded-up storefronts, casting weak pools of light onto empty streets. A gust of wind carried the scent of rain and something stale, like rust and regret. Through the dimly lit streets, Eleanor walked, her frail fingers wrapped tightly around the small, cold hand of Nathan, her 7-year-old grandson. His tiny steps struggled to match hers, but he didn't complain. He never did. Nathan had learned early in life that some burdens were too heavy to speak about. Eleanor pulled her coat tighter around her thin frame, though the wool had long since lost its warmth. The deep ache in her bones had become a familiar companion, a reminder that time was slipping away faster than she could hold on to it. But nothing weighed heavier than the silent question pressing against her ribs. What will happen to him when I'm gone? She glanced down at Nathan. His jacket, once belonging to her youngest son, David, hung loosely on his small frame, the sleeves rolled up to keep from swallowing his hands. His shoes, scuffed and worn, barely had any sole left. Too young to understand the depth of their struggle, yet too old to ignore the emptiness in their cupboards. Nathan had already learned what it meant to go without. He lifted his face toward her, his brown eyes holding that quiet kind of wisdom that no child should ever have to carry. "Grandma?" His voice was soft, uncertain. "Yes, sweetheart," she asked, forcing warmth into her voice despite the tightness in her chest. "Are we going home soon?" Home. The word felt like a cruel joke. Their apartment, if you could call it that, was nothing more than a cramped, one-room space with a heater that rattled like an old man's cough and windows that whistled when the wind blew. But it was shelter, and right now that was all that mattered. "Soon?" she murmured, brushing a strand of his dark hair away from his forehead. Nathan nodded, accepting her answer the way he always did. He never asked for more than she could give, and that was the part that broke her the most. A sudden gust of wind rattled a street sign, making it sway on rusted hinges. Across the street, a liquor store's neon open sign flickered, its buzzing the only sound cutting through the night. Somewhere in the distance, the shrill bark of a stray dog echoed between the buildings. The city was alive, but none of it felt like a place for them. Eleanor coughed suddenly, the sound ripping through her chest like tearing fabric. She pressed a hand to her ribs, trying to steady herself. Nathan looked up at her, his brow creased in concern, but she quickly straightened and gave him a small smile, as if to say, "I'm fine." But she wasn't. Her body was failing. The sickness had been creeping in for months. First a small fatigue, then the weight in her chest, then the cough that never seemed to leave. At night when she lay awake staring at the water-stained ceiling of their apartment, she would press a hand to her heart and wonder how much longer she had. What would happen to Nathan when she was gone? The thought nearly stole her breath more than the illness ever could. No one would come for him. There were no relatives left, no kind neighbors to take him in. The city had swallowed their family one by one. First Michael, her eldest, who had kissed her cheek and promised to be home for dinner, only to be found days later in a vacant lot. Then David, who had chased after all the wrong things and paid for it with his life. Now Nathan was all she had left, and she was all he had. She squeezed his hand a little tighter. He didn't flinch, didn't pull away. He simply held on, walking beside her in silence, trusting that wherever she led him, it would be safe. She wished she could believe that was true. As they continued down the darkened street, Eleanor made herself a promise. No matter what it took, she would make sure Nathan had a future, even if it meant breaking her own heart to give it to him. The night was quiet, but Eleanor Carter's mind was anything but. As she lay on the thin mattress of their cramped apartment, staring at the ceiling stained with watermarks and time, her chest rose and fell in shallow, uneven breaths. The cough had been worse that evening, rattling deep inside her like something broken. She pressed a frail hand to her ribs, feeling the sharp ache that never truly went away. Her body was failing. She had known it for months. But tonight, the weight of that truth sat heavier on her than ever before. Beside her on a makeshift bed of old blankets, Nathan slept. His small form barely moved, his breathing soft and steady. In sleep, he looked so much younger, so untouched by the weight of the world. But Eleanor knew better. Nathan had been carrying burdens far too heavy for a boy his age. And if she was honest with herself, she was running out of time to keep him safe. Her gaze drifted toward the tiny window, where the glow of street lights cast shifting shadows on the peeling wallpaper. How many more nights did they have left together? How many more mornings would she wake up to see his sleepy face, his small hands rubbing at his eyes as he stretched? The thought sent a shiver through her, one that had nothing to do with the cold creeping through the cracks in the walls. She couldn't wait any longer. Eleanor turned onto her side, barely wincing at the dull pain in her joints. She reached out, her fingers brushing lightly against Nathan's arm. He stirred slightly but didn't wake. Good. Let him have this night. Let him sleep in the safety of their world, however small and broken it was, for just a little while longer. Tomorrow everything would change. When the morning came, it arrived with an unsettling stillness. The air was heavy, thick with the promise of rain. Eleanor dressed slowly, carefully, as if every movement carried the weight of what she was about to do. She reached for Nathan's coat, the one that had once belonged to David, and knelt beside him, brushing the hair from his forehead. "Nathan," she whispered, her voice as gentle as the wind outside. He blinked awake, his dark eyes meeting hers with groggy confusion. "Grandma," she forced a smile. "We need to go somewhere today, sweetheart." He yawned, rubbing his eyes. "Where?" Eleanor hesitated. How could she possibly put this into words? How could she tell him that by the time the sun set, she would be walking away from him forever? "I just need you to trust me," she said instead, her voice steady despite the tremor in her hands. "Can you do that?" Nathan nodded without question, because that was the kind of boy he was, one who trusted, one who believed. And that made what she was about to do even more unbearable. She packed lightly, just enough to not raise suspicion. A small backpack with a change of clothes for Nathan. A few dollars, barely enough for bus fare. An old photograph tucked into her pocket of Michael and David as boys, their arms slung around each other, laughing at something long forgotten. She didn't need much, because after today, she would have nothing. The city was already awake when they stepped outside. Cars crawled through the streets, their tires splashing against puddles left from the night's light drizzle. People hurried past, their faces drawn, their eyes focused on anywhere but here. Eleanor held Nathan's hand tightly as they walked to the bus stop, her fingers trembling slightly against his smaller ones. She told herself it was the cold. The first bus was overcrowded, the kind where bodies pressed too close together, the air thick with the scent of sweat and exhaust fumes. Eleanor didn't mind. She was used to discomfort, but Nathan clung to her, shifting uncomfortably as strangers bumped into them with every lurch forward. She kept her arms protectively around him, shielding him as best she could. Transfers, more buses, more waiting, more aching in her bones. Each mile carried them farther from the life they had known and closer to a world that would never be theirs. By the time they reached Oak Ridge Hills, the contrast was startling. The cracked sidewalks and graffiti-covered buildings of Riverton were gone, replaced by smooth pavement, manicured lawns, and houses so large they could have fit her entire apartment inside their living rooms. Eleanor felt like an intruder, like she had stepped into a world where she didn't belong, and she hadn't, but Nathan had to. She took a deep breath. The weight in her chest grew heavier. She knew she wouldn't be able to carry it for much longer. The bus rumbled to a stop at the edge of Oak Ridge Hills, its brakes hissing like a tired sigh. The doors creaked open and Eleanor Carter stepped out, gripping Nathan's hand tightly as they set foot onto a sidewalk so pristine, it looked as if no one had ever struggled here. The contrast between this place and Riverton was staggering. Towering mansions lined the wide streets, each more extravagant than the last. Their grand windows gleamed in the afternoon sunlight, their manicured hedges trimmed to perfection. Smooth black driveways curved toward houses with wraparound porches and columns as tall as trees. A sleek, silver car purred past them, its driver not even sparing a glance at the old woman and the small boy standing at the edge of a world that was never meant for them. Eleanor swallowed hard. She had known Oak Ridge Hills would be different, but standing here now, it felt like a foreign land, a place where her presence felt like an intrusion, a mistake. The air itself was different, cleaner, carrying the faint scent of freshly cut grass and blooming roses. Nothing like the thick, gasoline-soaked air of Riverton. Nathan's grip tightened around her fingers. She looked down at him, at his wide, curious eyes taking in their surroundings. His small face was filled with wonder, but there was no fear, because he trusted her. That trust twisted like a knife in her chest. She couldn't do this here, in the open, on a sidewalk where people might notice. She had to find a place, somewhere quiet, somewhere safe. A few blocks away, nestled between the towering homes, she spotted a small park. It was nearly empty, just a quiet patch of green with a winding brick path, a few wooden benches, and a playground with swings that barely swayed in the light breeze. A fountain sat at the center, water spilling over smooth stone edges in a gentle, rhythmic trickle. This was the place. Eleanor led Nathan toward it, her heart pounding harder with each step. The weight of what she was about to do settled deeper into her bones, heavier than anything she had ever carried. She told herself this was right. This was the only way. But that didn't make it hurt any less. Reaching the farthest corner of the park, where an old oak tree cast a long shadow over a wooden bench, she stopped. "Nathan," she said, kneeling in front of him, taking both of his small hands in hers. The roughness of her fingers pressed against his soft skin. He blinked at her, tilting his head. "What is it, Grandma?" She forced a smile, though it trembled at the edges. "I need you to wait here for a little while, sweetheart." His brows furrowed slightly, not in fear, just confusion. "Why?" "I have to go find something, some help," she said carefully. "It won't take long. Just sit here and wait for me, okay?" Nathan hesitated, searching her face as if looking for something. Maybe reassurance, maybe answers she couldn't give. But in the end, he nodded. Because why wouldn't he? She had never given him a reason to doubt her. She had always come back. Eleanor swallowed the lump in her throat. She reached forward, brushing his hair from his forehead, trying to memorize every detail of his face. The curve of his small nose, the deep brown of his eyes, the way his lips pressed together when he was thinking. She pulled him into her arms, hugging him tighter than she ever had before. "I love you, Nathan," she whispered into his hair. "Never forget that." His arms wrapped around her as best as his small frame allowed. "I love you too, Grandma." She closed her eyes for a second, wishing she could freeze time, wishing she could be strong enough to stay. But she couldn't. She pulled away quickly before he could notice the tears burning at the corners of her eyes. She had to leave now, before she lost the strength to do it. She stood, turning away before she could see the way he watched her go, before she could let his innocent trust shatter the fragile resolve holding her together. One step, then another, then another. She walked quickly, forcing herself not to look back. If she looked back, she would break. If she looked back, she wouldn't be able to leave. So she didn't. She kept walking, past the fountain, past the park's entrance, out onto the clean sidewalks of Oak Ridge Hills, her heart pounding, her breath unsteady. The sound of her own footsteps felt deafening, each one carrying her further from the only thing she had left in the world. She reached the end of the block before the weight of it all crushed her. Her legs trembled, and she stumbled into the shadow of a towering maple tree, gripping its trunk for support. Her chest felt tight, her breath shallow. not from the sickness, but from the unbearable agony of leaving him. Tears slipped down her wrinkled cheeks as she lifted her eyes to the darkening sky, to the first faint stars beginning to blink through the veil of twilight. "Dear Lord," she whispered, her voice shaking, "please, please don't let me have made a mistake." She pressed a trembling hand to her lips, willing herself to stay strong, but the words poured from her anyway, desperate, pleading, a mother's last hope. "I don't know what else to do. I have nothing left to give him. No home, no food, no future. But someone here, someone in this place, has everything I don't. If it is your will, let one of them find him. Let one of them see him. Not just see, Lord, but care. Let them take him in. Let them give him the life I never could." A sharp sob caught in her throat, and she clutched her chest. "I am leaving him in your hands now. Please don't let him be alone." The wind stirred the leaves above her, whispering through the branches like a quiet response. But no voice came, no sign that she had been heard. Just the empty silence of the world moving on. She wiped her face, forcing her legs to move again. She had to keep walking. She had to believe that God had heard her, that somewhere in one of those homes a door would open, that Nathan, her sweet boy, would not be left in the cold for long. By the time the sun began to set, Nathan still sat beneath the oak tree waiting for someone who would never come back. The world of Oak Ridge Hills was alive with warmth and indulgence that night. From behind grand windows framed with heavy drapes, golden light spilled onto the empty streets, flickering like candle flames against the approaching dusk. Inside the towering mansions, families gathered around long, polished dining tables, their silverware clinking softly against fine china. The scent of roasted meats and fresh-baked bread drifted through the air, mingling with the laughter of children and the low hum of conversation. Crystal chandeliers glowed overhead, reflecting in the sparkling wine glasses held delicately in manicured hands. These homes, these lives, were untouched by struggle, untouched by the kind of hunger and fear that existed just beyond their iron gates. And outside, beneath the darkening sky, Nathan sat alone. The wooden bench beneath him felt cold, even through his too-thin jacket. The sun had dipped below the horizon, dragging the warmth of the day with it, and a sharp chill began to creep into the air. The park, which had once felt welcoming in the daylight, now stretched out in eerie silence. The neatly trimmed hedges cast long shadows. The playground stood empty, the swings barely swaying in the wind. Nathan pulled his knees up to his chest, wrapping his arms around them, his small fingers clutching the fabric of his sleeves. His grandmother had said she would come back. She had always come back. But the minutes turned to hours, and she didn't. He watched the street, waiting for the familiar sight of her slow, careful walk, for the warmth of her voice to call his name. But all he saw were the cars that passed without slowing, the figures of strangers who didn't glance his way. No one noticed him. No one wondered why a small boy sat alone in the cold. Somewhere across town, inside one of Oak Ridge Hill's grandest estates, Richard Sterling sat alone too. But his solitude was by choice. His home, a sprawling mansion built of stone and glass, was a monument to success, a place that commanded attention and admiration. The kind of place where power resided, where influence was wielded. But despite its grandeur, the house was silent. Richard sat in his study, behind a mahogany desk large enough to hold the weight of an empire. A fire crackled in the marble fireplace, its light flickering against the rich leather of his chair. His fingers tapped idly against the rim of a whiskey glass, but he hadn't taken a sip. The drink wasn't what he wanted. He wanted peace. But peace was something he had lost long ago. Once this house had been filled with life. Once he had been a different man. There had been a time when Emily would move through these halls with an effortless grace, her laughter trailing behind her like the faint scent of her perfume. She had been the light of this house, the force that kept him from disappearing into his work completely. And then, there had been Jacob. Jacob, with his messy blonde hair and the boundless energy of a boy who believed the world was still filled with magic. Jacob, who had once raced through the house, bare feet pounding against the floors, his laughter echoing down the long corridors. Richard could still hear it sometimes, faint, ghostly, a sound that no longer belonged in this house. On Jacob's 9th birthday, Richard had given him a gift, a small white puppy with floppy ears and eyes so big and bright that they seemed to take in everything. "He's yours," Richard had told his son, kneeling beside him as the puppy licked at Jacob's hands excitedly. "Take care of him." "I will, Dad, I promise." And Jacob had. From that day on, Bailey had become his constant companion. They had been inseparable, running through the gardens, curling up together on the couch, sneaking treats from the dinner table when they thought no one was looking. But then, the accident, a last-minute business trip, a flight that never made it back. One phone call had shattered everything. Emily and Jacob were gone, and the man Richard had once been had died with them. The laughter disappeared from the house, the warmth, the life, and Bailey. Bailey had waited by the front door, waited in Jacob's empty room, curled up in the blankets that no longer carried the scent of his boy. The dog had mourned in the only way he knew how, by refusing to leave the last places Jacob had been. And Richard? Richard had buried himself in work, in silence, in distance. He had let the world believe he was heartless, and maybe they were right. Maybe he had to be, because feeling meant remembering, and remembering meant pain. His grip on the whiskey glass tightened, his knuckles going white. He could still hear Emily's voice in his head, could still feel Jacob's small hand in his, could still picture Bailey's wagging tail on that birthday morning when everything had still been whole. But it was all gone. He exhaled slowly, pushing back the memories, swallowing them down like medicine that never quite worked. Bailey still lived in the house, but Richard barely noticed him anymore. The dog had become just another shadow in a place filled with them. He hadn't paid much attention to him in months. The little white dog, once Jacob's greatest treasure, lay curled up beside the cold marble steps of the back patio. His fur, once brushed to a glossy sheen by small, loving hands, was now dull and tangled. His ears perked slightly at the distant sound of laughter from inside, but no one called for him. No footsteps came to scoop him up, to pull him into a warm embrace. It had been so long since anyone had. Bailey had once belonged to a boy who loved him more than anything. Jacob had carried him everywhere, through the vast gardens, across the grand hallways, even to bed at night, where the dog would curl into the space beside him, safe in the warmth of his little master's arms. But Jacob was gone, and Bailey had waited. At first by the door. Every evening at the same time, his tail would wag, his ears would perk, his little paws shifting in anticipation. But the door never opened. Then he had waited by the staircase, where Jacob used to race down each morning, laughter tumbling from his lips. But the staircase remained empty, its silence a cruel mockery of the past. Bailey had waited until he no longer understood what he was waiting for, and so he stopped. Now he spent his days in the forgotten corners of the estate, wandering the halls that had once been filled with joy, but were now nothing more than a grand, empty shell. No one shooed him away, but no one noticed him either. He had become just another part of the house, something that existed but no longer mattered. And then one night, the garden gate was left open. No one saw it. No one cared. The grand estate, for all its wealth, had grown careless. And for the first time since he had been brought to this place, Bailey had a choice. He stepped toward the opening hesitantly, glancing back at the house that no longer felt like home. Would Jacob have wanted him to stay? Bailey stood at the threshold for a long moment, his small paws resting on the cold stone pathway. The wind carried the faint scent of the outside world. Grass, damp earth, something unknown but calling to him. No one was coming for him. No one had come for him in a long, long time. So without another glance back, Bailey walked through the gate. The world beyond the estate was different, larger, unfamiliar. The neatly trimmed grass gave way to hard pavement, and the warm glow of the house was replaced by the cold indifference of the night. He padded down the quiet streets of Oak Ridge Hills, his small body casting a lonely shadow beneath the streetlights. He had no destination, no direction, only a need to keep moving. Bailey didn't know how long he walked, only that the farther he went, the more invisible he became. People passed by, their designer coats pulled tightly around them, their eyes flicking to him for only a moment before quickly looking away. No one kneeled down to pet him. No one called him a good boy. No one saw him. A car slowed as it passed, its headlights sweeping over his small, trembling form. The window rolled down just slightly, and a woman's voice muttered, "Disgusting. Someone should call animal control." The car drove off, tires hissing against the pavement, leaving him alone once again. Bailey lowered his head, his ears flattening as he walked on. He didn't know what animal control was, but something in the woman's voice told him it wasn't good. The street stretched endlessly, lined with mansions that held warmth he would never be invited into. But then up ahead he saw something, a park. It wasn't like the grand gardens of the estate, no perfectly sculpted hedges, no elaborate fountains that gurgled with elegance. It was smaller, quieter, a little forgotten. And in the faint glow of the street lamps, sitting on a worn wooden bench beneath a towering oak tree, was a boy. Bailey slowed, his nose twitching as he took in the scent of something familiar, something safe. The night had settled deep over Oak Ridge Hills, and with it came an unforgiving cold. The wind had picked up, slipping through the trees, rustling the dry leaves that had gathered at the edges of the park's walkways. The once neatly arranged flower beds were now dark patches of earth, their petals long closed for the night. The streetlights flickered weakly, casting dim halos onto the pavement, barely pushing back the shadows creeping in from all sides. Nathan curled tighter on the worn wooden bench, his knees pulled to his chest, his arms wrapped around his small frame. His grandmother's absence had begun to feel real now, like a hollow space in his chest that grew wider with each passing moment. He had told himself over and over that she would come back, but the stars were already high above him, and still she hadn't returned. His stomach let out a sharp, painful growl, but he had long since stopped hoping for food. Hunger was nothing new, neither was cold, but the loneliness, that was something else entirely. Then in the quiet of the park, he heard it, a small sound, soft, hesitant, the faintest shuffle of movement against the pavement. Nathan's head lifted slowly, his breath catching in his throat. At first, he thought the night had conjured up a ghost, a small, pale figure standing a few feet away, its shape barely visible in the dim light. But then, the figure shifted, and he could see two dark eyes staring back at him, filled with something familiar. Sadness, fear, longing. It was a dog. Nathan sat frozen, his tired mind struggling to make sense of what he was seeing. The little creature stood motionless, its white fur matted and dirty, its ears drooping slightly, as if waiting to be chased away. The dog's thin body trembled in the cold, but still, it didn't move any closer. Nathan swallowed, his voice barely above a whisper. "Hey there, don't be scared." The dog's ears twitched, but it didn't run. Nathan slowly uncurled his legs, lowering himself to sit on the edge of the bench. He reached out a cautious hand, keeping his movements slow, gentle, the way his grandmother used to do when stray cats wandered near their old apartment. For a moment, the dog only stared. Then hesitantly, it took a step forward. Nathan held perfectly still, his fingers just inches from the dog's nose. The little creature hesitated, then finally leaned in, pressing its cold, wet nose against his outstretched fingers. A breath of relief escaped Nathan's lips, his chest tightening with something he hadn't felt in hours, maybe even longer. Warmth. Not the kind that came from food or a thick blanket, but the kind that came from knowing, even for just a moment, that he wasn't completely alone. "See?" he whispered, barely more than a breath. "I won't hurt you." The dog let out a quiet whimper, a sound so soft, so filled with exhaustion, that Nathan felt it deep in his bones. Carefully, he slid down from the bench and sat on the ground, crossing his legs as the dog took another small step toward him. Nathan knew what it felt like to be afraid, to wonder if someone would turn their back on you. So when the dog hesitated again, caught between trust and fear, Nathan did the only thing he could think of. He waited. Seconds stretched between them, long and uncertain. Then slowly the dog stepped closer, then closer still, until finally it curled up against Nathan's side. The warmth of the small body pressed against him sent a rush of unexpected comfort through him. Nathan didn't realize how much he had been shaking until he felt the dog's soft, steady breaths against his arm. Without thinking, he reached out, gently running his fingers through the dog's fur. It was tangled and rough, but beneath it he could feel the slow rise and fall of its ribs, the quiet beat of its heart. The dog let out a soft sigh, pressing closer, as if melting into him. Nathan let his head rest back against the bench, his eyes drifting up toward the stars. For the first time since his grandmother had left him, the ache in his chest wasn't quite so heavy. He didn't know where she was. He didn't know if she was coming back. But right now he wasn't alone. And somehow, that was enough. A cold morning settled over Oak Ridge Hills, bringing with it the heavy gray of an overcast sky. The first hints of dawn crept over the rooftops, casting pale streaks of light through the bare branches of the trees. The city was waking, but for Nathan, the night had never really ended. He stirred, curled up on the park bench, his small body pressed against Bailey's for warmth. But the cold had settled deep into his bones, making every movement stiff and sluggish. His fingers ached, his lips felt dry, and his stomach was a hollow, twisting knot of pain. He groaned softly, shifting his weight, but the ache in his belly didn't ease. It had been too long since he'd eaten anything. The hunger wasn't new. He had felt it many times before, back in Riverton, when his grandmother had given him the last bit of food they had, pretending she wasn't hungry. But this time was worse, because this time she wasn't here. Bailey stirred beside him, lifting his head groggily. His ears twitched at the distant hum of the city coming to life. Car doors slamming, muffled voices from people heading to work. The distant chime of a church bell marking the early hour. He let out a small, tired whimper, then pressed his nose against Nathan's arm, as if sensing his distress. Nathan forced a small smile, running his fingers through the dog's fur. "I know, buddy," he murmured. "I'm hungry too." Bailey let out a quiet sigh and nuzzled closer, but Nathan knew that comfort wouldn't fill their stomachs. They needed food. He hesitated, glancing toward the neat rows of houses beyond the park. Someone in this neighborhood had to have extra food, more than they needed, more than they'd miss. But he had learned a long time ago that people didn't just give things away. Still, he had to try. Nathan sat up slowly, careful not to disturb Bailey too much. He gave the dog a final pat on the head before standing, his legs wobbly from a night spent on the hard wooden bench. "You stay here, okay?" he whispered, crouching beside Bailey. The dog's ears perked up, and for a moment, Nathan wondered if he would follow. But Bailey stayed still, watching him with tired, trusting eyes. Nathan took a deep breath, pulling his jacket tighter around him, and started walking. The streets of Oak Ridge Hills looked different in the morning light. The mansions stood in quiet elegance, their curtains drawn, their driveways empty except for sleek, expensive cars. It felt like a different world, one where people woke up in warm beds, had breakfast waiting on polished kitchen tables, and never once had to wonder where their next meal would come from. His stomach twisted again. Keep going. It wasn't long before he spotted a small bakery on the corner of a quiet street. The windows were fogged with warmth from the ovens inside, and through the glass he could see shelves lined with golden loaves of bread, pastries dusted with sugar, and baskets of fresh rolls. The scent was overwhelming, buttery, rich, the kind of smell that made his mouth water instantly. For a moment he hesitated, feeling the familiar sting of shame. But hunger overpowered pride. He stepped inside. A small bell jingled above the door, and the warmth of the shop wrapped around him instantly. The scent of baking bread filled his lungs, almost making him lightheaded. He swallowed hard and stepped forward. Behind the counter, a thick-set man with a graying mustache wiped his hands on a flour-dusted apron. He barely glanced at Nathan before turning back to his work. Nathan took a shaky breath. "Excuse me, sir?" The baker didn't look up. "We open in 15 minutes. Nathan hesitated, his fingers curled into fists at his sides. "I don't have any money, but if you have anything left over, anything you were going to throw away, maybe I could—" Before he could finish, the man's head snapped up. His eyes narrowed. "We don't give out free food." Nathan flinched at the sharpness in his tone. "I wasn't asking for free. "I don't care what you were asking," the man interrupted, his voice firm. "This is a business, not a charity. If you don't have money, you're wasting my time." Nathan felt his face burn, not just from embarrassment, but from the familiar sting of rejection. He lowered his gaze, swallowing back the lump in his throat. "Sorry," he muttered, backing toward the door. The bell jingled again as he stepped outside, the warmth of the bakery vanishing as the cold morning air wrapped around him once more. His stomach twisted painfully. He needed food, and if no one would give it to him, he'd have to find it another way. With quiet determination, he made his way to the alley behind the bakery. The ground was damp with the morning frost, the walls lined with old crates and garbage bins. His hands trembled as he lifted the lid of the nearest bin, the sour smell of discarded food making his stomach turn. He hesitated. Digging through trash wasn't something he had ever imagined himself doing, but hunger had a way of forcing people past their limits. He took a deep breath and reached inside, searching through crumpled paper and empty containers until, there, his fingers brushed against something solid, a roll. It was small, slightly crushed and stale, but it was food. He pulled it out, wiping it on the sleeve of his jacket. It wasn't much, but it was something. Clutching the roll to his chest, he turned and ran. Back through the streets, back past the towering houses, back to the only place that still felt safe. Bailey was still curled up on the bench when he arrived. The dog lifted his head at the sound of Nathan's footsteps, his ears perking up as the boy sank to the ground beside him, breathless. Nathan broke the roll in half and held out a piece. "Here," he murmured. "It's not much, but it's what we've got." Bailey sniffed the bread, then took it gently from Nathan's fingers, chewing slowly. Nathan ate his half in small bites, forcing himself to savor it. Meanwhile, at the Sterling estate, Richard Sterling sat in his study, his morning coffee untouched. He glanced at his watch, his routine as precise as ever. The house was quiet, the staff moving about their task efficiently, just as they always had. But something felt off. It took him a moment to realize what it was. The silence. Not just any silence. The absence of tiny paws tapping across the marble floor. Richard frowned, standing abruptly. He walked through the house, scanning the familiar spaces. Bailey's favorite spot by the fireplace. The cushion near the large window where he liked to nap in the morning sun. Empty. His frown deepened. He called for the housekeeper. "Where's the dog?" The woman hesitated. I'm not sure, sir. I assumed he was outside." Richard's chest tightened. Something was wrong. He strode toward the back of the house, stepping onto the sprawling patio that led to the garden. The air was crisp, the morning still young. His sharp eyes scanned the yard, the tall hedges, the empty lawn. Then he saw it, the side gate, swinging slightly in the breeze. Richard's pulse spiked. Bailey was gone. His jaw clenched. Without missing a beat, he turned on his heel, already pulling out his phone. "I want every available man looking for that dog," he ordered. "Now." He ended the call, slipping the phone back into his pocket. His hands curled into fists as he stared at the open gate, a strange feeling settling in his chest. Richard Sterling never panicked. He never allowed emotion to dictate his actions. But as he stepped back into the house, something unsettling settled in his chest. Because for the first time in years, he realized he wasn't just looking for a lost dog. He was looking for the last piece of his son. At the park, the stale bread had done little to satisfy the gnawing hunger in Nathan's stomach, but it was something. For now. Beside him, Bailey had finished his small portion, licking the last crumbs from Nathan's palm before curling up against his side. The little dog let out a contented sigh, his body warm against the cold morning air. Nathan leaned his head back against the wooden bench and closed his eyes for a brief moment. His limbs ached and exhaustion pulled at him, but his mind wouldn't let him rest. Food wouldn't just appear, and they couldn't survive another day on scraps. He had to find something more. Nathan sat up, rubbing the stiffness from his legs, and looked down at Bailey. The little dog blinked up at him with quiet trust, his tail giving a weak thump against the ground. "I'll figure something out," Nathan murmured, as if saying it out loud would make it true. Pushing himself to his feet, he lifted Bailey into his arms and started walking. The streets of Oak Ridge Hills were fully awake now. Cars rolled down the smooth pavement, their polished exteriors gleaming in the morning light. The scent of coffee and fresh pastries drifted from the open doors of high-end cafes, where well-dressed people sat sipping lattes and reading newspapers as if the world had never known hunger. Nathan kept his head down, moving quickly past the places where he knew he wouldn't be welcome. He didn't belong in those cafes, those stores, those warm, safe houses. But maybe, just maybe, there was somewhere that would let him work. After what felt like hours of wandering, his eyes landed on a small market tucked between two brick buildings. It wasn't like the sleek grocery stores where people filled carts with overpriced produce. This place had a worn-out wooden sign above the door, its letters slightly faded with time. The large front window was fogged from the warmth inside, and behind the glass, Nathan could see rows of fresh bread lined neatly on wooden shelves. His stomach clenched at the sight. Bailey whimpered softly, nuzzling his head against Nathan's chest, as if sensing his hesitation. Nathan exhaled, gently setting Bailey down just outside the entrance. "Stay here, okay?" he whispered. Bailey let out a quiet whine, but obeyed, curling up near a stack of wooden crates by the door. His ears perked, his dark eyes watching Nathan closely. Nathan gave him one last reassuring glance before stepping inside. A small bell jingled as the door swung shut behind him, and immediately, the warmth of the shop wrapped around him like a blanket. The air smelled of fresh bread, roasted coffee, and something faintly sweet, maybe cinnamon. Nathan's stomach twisted painfully, but he forced himself to focus. Behind the counter, an elderly man with silver hair and flour-dusted sleeves was arranging loaves of bread into neat rows. His name, Mr. Thompson, was etched into a small wooden plaque near the register. His weathered face was lined with deep creases, but his sharp eyes softened slightly when he noticed Nathan standing there. Nathan swallowed hard, clutching the edge of his sleeves to keep his hands from shaking. "Sir, I don't have any money," he started, forcing himself to keep his voice steady. "But I can work. I can sweep, clean, anything you need. I just need something to eat." Mr. Thompson didn't say anything right away. He set down the loaf he was holding and studied Nathan, his gaze lingering on the boy's thin frame, the hollowness in his cheeks, the way he shifted uneasily, as if bracing for rejection. For a long moment, Nathan thought he'd be turned away. Again. But then, the old man exhaled and nodded toward the back of the shop. "Broom's by the door," he said gruffly. "Floor could use a good sweep." Nathan barely stopped himself from sighing in relief. "Thank you, sir," he murmured, before hurrying to grab the broom. For the first time in what felt like forever, he had a purpose. As he swept, his movements were quick and precise, the way his grandmother had taught him. He worked in silence, pushing bits of flour and stray crumbs into a neat pile, focusing on the rhythmic motion of the broom scraping against the wooden floor. And every now and then, through the fogged window, he could see Bailey still sitting outside, patiently waiting. The little dog hadn't moved from his spot. Nathan's heart ached at the sight. At least he wasn't alone. Minutes passed, and when Nathan finally straightened, the floor looked spotless. He turned toward Mr. Thompson, who had been watching him from behind the counter. The old man grunted in approval. "Good work." He reached behind him and grabbed something from a small wooden shelf. A roll of bread, still warm from the oven. Nathan's breath caught in his throat as the baker held it out to him. "Here," Mr. Thompson said simply, "for the work." Nathan hesitated for only a second before taking it with both hands, the warmth of the bread seeping into his fingers. "Thank you," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. The old man just nodded. "You hungry? You come back. Work for it, and you'll eat." Nathan's throat tightened. He could only nod before quickly turning toward the door. The bell jingled again as he stepped outside, and the moment Bailey saw him, the dog's tail thumped happily against the ground. Nathan let out a breath of relief and dropped to his knees beside Bailey, breaking the roll in half. He held out a piece to the little dog, who eagerly took it from his hands. Nathan took a bite of his half, chewing slowly, savoring the warmth of real food. For the first time in days, it didn't feel like the world had forgotten them. But then, the moment shattered. A voice rang out from across the street, sharp and urgent. "There's the kid with the dog!" Nathan's entire body went rigid. His head snapped up and his blood turned to ice as he saw them. Two men in dark suits standing near the curb, their eyes locked onto him. Panic surged through him. They were here for Bailey. Nathan didn't stop to think. He lunged forward, scooped Bailey into his arms, and ran. Nathan's heart slammed against his ribs as his feet pounded against the pavement. His breath came in short, ragged gasps, but he didn't dare slow down. Not now. Not when they were so close. He tightened his grip on Bailey. The little dog pressed against his chest, his body trembling with every frantic step. Behind him, heavy footsteps thundered down the quiet streets of Oak Ridge Hills. "Hey, kid, stop!" one of the men shouted. Nathan didn't stop. He couldn't. His mind raced as he darted between parked cars, cutting across perfectly manicured lawns. The houses loomed around him, pristine and untouched, oblivious to the desperate chase unfolding just outside their windows. A sharp turn, another street, a quick glance over his shoulder. They were still there. Two men in dark suits, their strides long and powerful, their eyes locked onto him like wolves closing in on their prey. Nathan's pulse roared in his ears. Think, think. Then, a narrow alleyway. He veered toward it, his shoes skidding slightly on the pavement as he ducked into the shadows, pressing himself against the cold brick wall. His lungs burned, his arms ached from holding Bailey so tightly, but he forced himself to be still. Bailey trembled in his grasp, his small body pressing into Nathan's chest. "Shh," Nathan whispered, stroking the dog's fur. "They can't find us." The footsteps slowed. Nathan held his breath. "Where'd he go?" one of the men muttered. "Damn, this kid is fast. But he's holding Mr. Richard Sterling's dog," the other growled. "I have to call and report the situation to the boss," another voice rang out. And then, the sound of their footsteps faded away. Nathan's fingers curled into Bailey's fur, his heart hammering as he waited. Waited? Then finally the sound of footsteps retreated. A sharp breath escaped his lips. His muscles sagged with relief. They were gone, but they'd come back. He knew it. They wouldn't stop until they found Bailey. He had to keep moving. Nathan slipped out of the alley, his body still tense, every nerve in his body on high alert. He didn't know where he was going, only that he had to put as much distance as possible between himself and those men. Then, he saw it. At the end of the street, standing alone beneath the gray morning sky, was an old church. The towering stone walls, weathered by time, rose like a silent guardian above the quiet street. Its wooden doors were slightly ajar, revealing only darkness within, a hiding place, a sanctuary. Nathan didn't hesitate. He ran up the steps, his legs nearly giving out beneath him, and pushed through the doors. Inside, the world was still. The air was thick with the scent of melted wax and aged wood, the only light coming from a row of flickering candles near the altar. Rows of empty pews stretched out before him, their polished surfaces gleaming faintly in the dim glow. Nathan staggered forward, his breath uneven, his body trembling. They wouldn't find him here. Bailey whimpered softly in his arms. Nathan knelt behind a pew, lowering Bailey onto the wooden floor. He gently stroked the dog's fur, whispering, "It's okay, buddy. We're safe." Bailey shifted slightly, his dark eyes filled with exhaustion. Nathan leaned his head against the cool wood, forcing himself to take slow, steady breaths. They had escaped. At least that's what he thought. Until he heard it, a slow, deliberate footstep. Nathan's blood turned to ice. The sound echoed through the vast emptiness of the church, followed by another. Steady, unhurried, certain. Nathan's breath caught in his throat. Then, a voice, deep, calm, unmistakable. "I know you're here." Nathan's heart stopped. Richard Sterling had found him. Time seemed to stop. Nathan held Bailey tight against his chest, feeling the small dog's heartbeat racing beneath his trembling fingers. Across from him, Richard Sterling stood motionless, his sharp gaze locked onto the boy. His face was unreadable, cold, distant, but his eyes held something else, something Nathan couldn't name. The church was silent, the faint glow of colored light filtering through the stained glass windows. The air smelled of melted wax and aged wood. No one else was there, just them. Bailey let out a soft whimper, pressing his tiny body closer into Nathan's arms. The boy could feel the dog's warmth against his ribs, a fragile comfort against the chill of the moment. Then Richard spoke. His voice was low, controlled, final. "Give me the dog." Nathan's body went rigid. His arms tightened around Bailey as if sheer willpower could keep him safe. "No." Richard's expression didn't change. "I'm not asking." His tone was calm but absolute. "He's mine." Nathan shook his head violently, his breath coming faster, his chest rising and falling as panic clawed at him. "No, he's not. He found me. I took care of him when no one else did." Richard exhaled slowly, deliberately. "You don't understand what you're saying, kid." "I do." Nathan's voice cracked, raw with emotion. He clenched his fists. "He needs me, just like I need him." A flicker of something crossed Richard's face. His jaw tensed. His dark eyes scanned the boy, his filthy clothes, his trembling hands, the thinness of his face. A boy who had nothing, clinging to the only thing left in his world. And suddenly, Richard saw himself. Not the man he was now, but the man he had been. A lifetime ago, he had knelt just like this, gripping on to something he loved, begging for it not to be taken away. He had prayed, pleaded, screamed, and no one had listened. A shadow passed over his face, but only for a second. Then, he shut it out, like he always did. Without hesitation, he stepped forward. Nathan flinched, trying to back away, but he wasn't fast enough. Richard's hand shot out, gripping Bailey, pulling. Bailey let out a frightened yelp, squirming, his small paws reaching for Nathan. Nathan held on with everything he had. "No!" he screamed, his fingers digging into Bailey's fur. "Please!" But Richard was stronger. With a sharp tug, Bailey was ripped from Nathan's grasp. Nathan stumbled back, his arms suddenly empty, his breath knocked from his lungs. For a second, he was frozen. Then, he lunged. But Richard had already turned. Bailey barked in distress, twisting in Richard's arms, but the man didn't stop walking. Nathan's legs gave out beneath him. He hit the cold stone floor with a choked gasp, his small hands clawing at nothing. His vision blurred, his chest burned. He wanted to scream, to fight, to make Richard understand. But the man never looked back. With one final slam, the heavy doors of the church shut behind him. Nathan sat there, frozen in the empty silence. His whole world had just been taken away. The Sterling estate was drowning in silence. Not the peaceful kind, but the kind that suffocates, that presses against the walls like a weight too heavy to bear. The kind of silence that lingers in a house that has long since lost its warmth. Richard stepped through the dimly lit hallway and into his study. The fire crackled faintly in the hearth, its glow flickering against the polished wood floors. With slow, deliberate movements, he lowered Bailey onto the plush cushion beside the fireplace. The very spot the dog had once curled up in when Jacob was still running through these halls, laughing, alive. Richard straightened, rubbing a tired hand across his face. "You're home now." Bailey didn't move. The little dog remained curled up, his head resting on his paws. No tail wag, no eager yelp, no relief. Richard frowned. "Come on, boy, go eat." He reached for Bailey's food dish and placed it closer, expecting the familiar sound of paws patting toward it. But Bailey didn't even lift his head. He didn't sniff the air, didn't stir. A flicker of something uncomfortable twisted in Richard's chest, something he couldn't quite name. He turned abruptly, striding toward his private bar. He poured himself a drink, barely aware of the motion, and brought the glass to his lips. The whiskey burned as it slid down his throat, but it did nothing to dull the sharp feeling gnawing at the back of his mind. Through the large window, the garden stretched out before him, bathed in silver moonlight. He should have felt at peace. He had won. He had taken back what was his. So why did he feel so empty? His grip on the glass tightened. Since leaving that church, something inside him had been unsettled. An image kept forcing its way into his mind. Small hands clutching at the air, a choked sob, wide, tear-filled eyes staring up at him in devastation. Nathan. His breath hitched slightly, and his fingers pressed against his temple. Forget it. The words formed in his mind like a command. Don't think about it. It doesn't matter. But it did. Because every time he blinked, he saw the boy on the ground, his frail shoulders shaking, his entire world crumbling before him. And he saw something else, a reflection of himself, years ago, the day he lost everything. A day when he had been the one left behind, the one who had begged for mercy and received nothing but silence in return. His breath came slower now, heavier. His gaze flickered back to Bailey. The dog still hadn't moved, and suddenly he understood. Bailey wasn't mourning being lost. He was mourning being taken away from the only one who mattered to him now. Richard's throat tightened. His hand trembled slightly as he set the glass down. Slowly, he sank into the nearest chair, his elbows resting on his knees, his hands covering his face. And for the first time in years, a feeling he had buried deep, so deep he thought it was gone forever, rose to the surface. Regret. Morning had barely broken over Oak Ridge Hills, casting a soft golden glow across the empty sidewalks. The world was beginning to stir, the hum of early commuters, the distant sound of shopkeepers unlocking their doors, and the faint aroma of fresh bread drifting from nearby bakeries. Nathan sat slumped against the wall of a small bakery, his knees pulled tightly to his chest. He was exhausted. His limbs felt heavy, his stomach hollow with hunger. But none of it mattered as much as the emptiness inside him. He had lost too much. Hunger, pain. Those were nothing compared to the ache of knowing that Bailey was gone. Through the glass, he could see shelves lined with golden pastries, warm loaves of bread, and delicate cookies wrapped in bright ribbons. For a fleeting second, he imagined stepping inside, picking out something sweet, feeling the warmth of a home that had never been his. But that wasn't his reality. His world had no warmth, no home, no one left to hold his hand. He let out a slow, tired breath and rested his head against his knees, closing his eyes against the gentle morning breeze. A black car rolled to a stop by the curb. From inside, Richard Sterling watched him. The boy was exactly where his thoughts had led him all night, alone. His clothes were dirtier than before, his face more hollow, his small body curled in on itself like he was trying to disappear. In that moment, Richard thought, if the wind blew too hard, the boy might simply vanish. Why was he here? Why, after everything, had his own steps led him back to this child? He didn't understand, but his hand reached for the door handle anyway. The soft thud of the car door closing made Nathan's head lift, his weary eyes blinking against the soft morning light. At first, all he saw were shiny leather shoes. Then he looked up, and his heart clenched. It was him, the man who had taken Bailey. Nathan's breath caught, his fingers curling into fists. His entire body went rigid, his exhaustion momentarily replaced by the sharp sting of betrayal. What was he doing here? Hadn't he taken enough? Nathan wanted to say something, wanted to tell him to leave. But before he could speak, Richard reached into his coat and pulled out a small paper bag. Here. Nathan hesitated. Richard was offering him something. Nathan's eyes flickered between the bag and Richard's unreadable face. Mistrust, pain, anger. A whirlwind of emotions clashed inside him, but his body made the choice for him. With trembling fingers, Nathan reached out and took the bag. Slowly he opened it, the scent of fresh bread filling his senses. His stomach twisted painfully, and before he could stop himself, he tore off a small piece and put it in his mouth. Warmth. It melted against his tongue, soft and rich, like something he had once known but had long since forgotten. His vision blurred. Tears slid down his cheeks before he even realized they had formed. He ate slowly, savoring every bite as if each one were a miracle. Richard said nothing. He only watched. Nathan swallowed hard, his throat tightening, not from hunger, but from something deeper. And then, in a voice so quiet it was barely a whisper, he said, "God sent you here." Richard's chest tightened. Something inside him shifted, pressing against walls he had spent years building. His breath grew unsteady, his throat dry. The boy's words hit him harder than they should have, because for the first time in longer than he could remember, he felt vulnerable, and in that moment, he understood. Nathan didn't just need help. He did too. The afternoon sun hung low over Oak Ridge Hills, casting golden light across the city. The streets were alive with movement, people leaving work, families strolling past boutiques, the scent of fresh coffee and baked bread lingering in the warm air. But for Richard Sterling, the world outside barely registered. The entire day had passed in a haze. He had tried to return to his routine, meetings, calls, reviewing financial reports, but none of it held his attention. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw Nathan. The way the boy had sat curled up in front of the bakery, his fingers trembling as he held the piece of bread. The quiet, broken way he had whispered, "God sent you here." Richard had built his life on logic, on control, but today, he couldn't silence the voice in his head. By late afternoon, he stopped trying. Instead, he grabbed his coat, stepped outside, and got into his car. His destination was already clear. For the first time in years, he was going to do the right thing. The park was quiet when Richard arrived. Nathan was still there, sitting on the same weathered wooden bench, his arms wrapped tightly around his knees. His small frame was bathed in the amber glow of the setting sun, making him look even smaller than Richard remembered. He had been there all day, waiting for nothing. But this time, he wasn't alone, because Richard hadn't come empty-handed. He was carrying Bailey, the little dog who had spent the entire day lying motionless in the corner of the mansion, had stirred the moment Richard stepped outside, as if he knew where they needed to go. And Richard finally understood. Bailey didn't belong in a house of silence. He belonged with Nathan. As Richard approached, Nathan slowly lifted his head. At first, he saw only Richard. Then his eyes landed on the small bundle in his arms. His breath hitched. "Bailey?" At the sound of his name, Bailey perked up, and then, suddenly, his tail began wagging. Nathan shot to his feet, his chest rising and falling with disbelief. Richard stopped in front of him. Without a word, he held Bailey out. Nathan hesitated, just for a second, before reaching forward, his fingers brushing against warm, familiar fur. Bailey whimpered, licking his face, his tiny body wriggling with joy. Nathan squeezed his eyes shut, holding him close. His arms trembled. Tears burned behind his eyelids, but he didn't care. Bailey was here. He was real. When he finally looked up at Richard, his voice was barely a whisper. Why are you doing this?" Richard held his gaze, his expression unreadable. Then quietly he said, "Because he needs you." Nathan swallowed hard, his fingers curled into Bailey's fur, holding on like he was afraid this moment might slip away. Then slowly, his gaze lifted again, and for the first time, Richard didn't look like the cold, distant man from before. Not the man who had ripped Bailey from his arms, not the man who had ignored his cries. He was someone else now. "I want to help you, Nathan." Nathan didn't move. "I can give you a home, food, a place to sleep. You don't have to live on the streets anymore." Nathan's chest rose and fell with uneven breaths. Could he trust him? Bailey snuggled closer, his tiny body warm against Nathan's heart. He looked up at the boy with bright, trusting eyes, as if he already knew what the answer should be. Nathan exhaled shakily, and for the first time in a long, long time, he took a chance. With a small, hesitant nod, he whispered, "Okay." Richard didn't say anything. Instead, he extended his hand. Nathan hesitated only for a second. Then slowly, he reached out. His small fingers slipped into Richard's palm, and together, with Bailey trotting beside them, they walked toward a new beginning. The days that followed were unlike anything Nathan had ever known. He had stepped into Richard Sterling's world, but it wasn't the cold, lifeless place he had imagined. It wasn't just grand hallways and expensive furniture. It was quiet dinners at a long table where Richard always made sure Nathan's plate was full. It was warm blankets on a bed that wasn't too small or too hard. It was Bailey racing through the halls, no longer lonely, no longer waiting by the door for someone who wouldn't come. At first, Nathan didn't trust it. Didn't trust the warmth, the comfort, the steadiness of it all. He had spent too long knowing that kindness could be taken away just as quickly as it was given. But the longer he stayed, the harder it became to deny. Richard meant it. The man who had once been nothing but a distant figure of wealth and power had changed. He still had sharp edges, still spoke in clipped, measured words, but there was something softer now. Nathan caught it in the way Richard would silently place a book on his nightstand when he noticed Nathan staring at the library shelves for too long, or the way he always made sure Bailey was let into Nathan's room at night because he knew the boy still had trouble sleeping without him. Richard never said much, but Nathan noticed, and slowly, Nathan let himself believe. But no matter how warm the house was, something still felt missing. Richard saw it in the way Nathan hesitated before reaching for his fork at dinner, as if expecting someone to tell him he wasn't allowed to eat. He saw it in the way the boy sometimes curled up in corners of the house instead of sitting on the couch, as if he were still trying to make himself invisible. And worst of all, he saw it in Nathan's eyes. There was a sadness there, one he didn't speak about, one that never fully left, even when he was laughing with Bailey or trying to hide a smile when Richard caught him sneaking extra snacks from the kitchen. Richard knew that look, because once upon a time, he had seen it in the mirror. So one evening, after Nathan had gone to bed, Richard picked up the phone, and he made a call. It was a week later when Richard told Nathan they were going out. "Where?" Nathan asked, curiosity flickering in his dark eyes. Richard simply said, "You'll see." Nathan didn't ask any more questions, but Richard could tell the boy was nervous. He sat quietly in the passenger seat as they drove through the city, his fingers tangled in Bailey's fur, holding on like a lifeline. When Richard pulled up to a quiet house on the edge of town, Nathan frowned. Richard turned off the engine. "Come on, Ma," he said. Nathan followed hesitantly, his small frame tensed with uncertainty. Richard led him up the porch steps, stopping just before the door. For a moment he said nothing. Then he knocked. The door creaked open, and standing there, tears already welling in her tired eyes, was Eleanor. Nathan froze, his breath hitched, and then he ran, straight into her arms. Eleanor let out a soft, broken cry, wrapping him up in the tightest embrace she had ever given. Her hands shook as they clutched his small frame, as if afraid that if she let go, he would disappear again. "My sweet boy," she whispered against his hair. "My sweet, sweet boy." Nathan buried his face in her shoulder, gripping the fabric of her coat as his small body shook. "You left," he choked. "You left me." Eleanor squeezed her eyes shut, her heart breaking all over again. "I know, my love," she whispered. "I know. And I will spend the rest of my life making it up to you." Richard watched from the porch, silent, giving them the moment they deserved. When Nathan finally pulled away, his face damp with tears, he turned to Richard. "You found her?" Richard nodded once. "She never stopped looking for you." Nathan turned back to Eleanor, studying her as if making sure she was real. Then without hesitation, he reached for her hand. "Come home," he whispered. Eleanor let out a small, shaky laugh through her tears. "Yes, my love, let's go home." The Sterling estate was different after that. It was no longer a house of cold silence. It was Bailey racing through the halls, barking happily as Nathan laughed. It was the smell of Eleanor's cooking filling the kitchen, her soft humming as she moved around, finally at peace. It was Richard sitting at the dining table, watching them with something unreadable in his expression, until Nathan turned to him with a smile, and that unreadable something softened into warmth. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, casting golden light across the grand estate, Eleanor stepped outside. She stood on the porch, gazing up at the vast sky, her heart heavy with gratitude. She clasped her hands together, whispering softly, "Thank you, Lord. Thank you for keeping Nathan safe. Thank you for leading him to the one man who could change his fate. Thank you for this second chance, this family." A gentle breeze brushed against her face, carrying with it the soft laughter of Nathan playing with Bailey in the garden. A single tear slipped down her cheek, not from sorrow but from the overwhelming, undeniable feeling that a miracle had happened. Because she knew, deep in her soul, that none of this was an accident. It was God's plan all along. There are stories that entertain us, stories that make us think, and then there are stories that change us. Nathan, Eleanor, Richard, and Bailey's journey is more than just a tale of survival. It's a testament to the power of redemption, second chances, and the quiet miracles that unfold when we least expect them. At its heart, this story reminds us of something we often forget in the chaos of life. Love heals. Nathan had every reason to believe the world had abandoned him. Eleanor carried the weight of regret, convinced she had failed the grandson she loved more than anything. And Richard? He had locked his heart away, believing that shutting out the world would protect him from pain. But love has a way of finding the cracks, slipping through even the hardest walls. Bailey wasn't just a dog. He was a bridge, a tiny spark of warmth that reignited the humanity in Richard, the hope in Nathan, and the faith in Eleanor. Through Bailey, a lost boy found a home, a grieving man found purpose, and a grandmother found redemption. And isn't that what we all long for? No matter how lost, broken, or undeserving we feel, love still finds a way. Richard learned that wealth and power mean nothing if your heart is empty. Nathan discovered that even after the deepest betrayal, forgiveness can open doors to a new future. Eleanor realized that though she had once walked away, love had led her back. Maybe you too have known loss. Maybe you've felt alone, convinced that no one sees you, no one is coming for you. But if this story teaches us anything, it's this. Miracles happen in the most unexpected ways. Sometimes they arrive as second chances. Sometimes they come as people who refuse to give up on us. And sometimes they appear in the form of a small white dog waiting patiently by the door. If this story touched your heart, help us share its message. Like, comment, and subscribe for more stories that remind us of the goodness in the world. And now we turn to you. Have you ever witnessed a miracle in your life? We'd love to hear your story, because somewhere out there, someone might need to know that miracles are still possible. Let's keep the conversation going.